for a little bit, I'm going to discuss some of the method, and then the second part, I want to actually have a workshop to take people in and actually look at some of the questions of problem solving that a composer would have to work through. Because I think this is all in preparation for actually working up to the Haydn and the Mozart breakthroughs. Because I think it's important to lay some of the groundwork for that. Because I know that for most people, we talk about solving problems in music, and since nobody's ever composed anything, they don't really have much idea about that. So I hope tonight we can actually at least begin to give people a little bit of a sense of it. So, but to start with, on the epistemological side of the thing, because, look, I mean, Lynn said in this latest three-part series, in Physical Economy as the Basis of Science, that real knowledge begins when you start moving away from sense perceptions to challenging axiomatic assumptions. And that's the way that I'm approaching this class series here. And that's the way that you can begin to take music out of the formal level and actually into the level of creativity, because ultimately that's what determines it. And most problems in musical analysis and musical discussion are that it gets bogged down at some kind of formal level within the notes of the page itself, and not actually at the level of the creative discovery of the composer. That's something we've been working at for a number of years. It's a difficult thing, but it's something that I think we really, with Lynn's work on the Motivführung, it's something he wants to push through. So I'll review, first of all, since it was so long since the last class, I'll just review quickly for people what we went through there. Because we looked at the problem of a formal logical deductive system and the false definition of the minimum. And when we took the note as the minimum, in the same way as a particle physicist would try to find the smallest particle, like a quark, and look at its own existence completely on its own, we found that you couldn't do anything. You had no basis for even constructing the well-tempered system, let alone composing a piece of music. And the next thing we did was we said, okay, maybe an interval is the minimum. And most of us fell into the trap of looking at an interval from the same standpoint as what you would call the immorality of pairwise relationships and social relationships. It's the social contract. It's the way that every economics textbook starts out, where, Joe wants to get the best price from, Doe wants to get the best price from Sol, and Sol wants to make the most profit off of Doe. And we rapidly discovered that is the notion of interval that Lynn said was the gas dynamical statistical model of an interval, which is an entropic concept of an interval and doesn't work. And then finally, we looked at it from the standpoint of the entire quantum field as generated by conical spiral action. And we found that it is only from that standpoint that you can locate a true singularity. And I would hope that as we're going through this, that people would be thinking, because a good class should not just be some objective class about music, where you're sitting there, outside of yourself, learning, facts about music. But in any kind of class, we should be learning something about the universe and something about ourselves. Because what we went through in that process makes it clear also about the role in which an individual actually functions. The only way you can actually be a true individual in this world is when you locate your own identity from the standpoint of a negentropically evolving universe and your direct impact on that. And it's the thing that Lynn talked about in Project A, where he said your direct relationship to the entire universe and the entire human race, past, present, and future, is the most important relationship you have. And that all of the pairwise relationships are determined from that. And it's when people make the mistake of other directedness, of thinking that it's the relationship to their immediate friends and neighbors that is critical. People think they're being individualists by being, separate from society. And it works the same in music. When you look at a note or an interval that way, it's impossible for it to have any kind of distinguishing quality. It's impossible for it to function as a singularity. The only way, what we discovered in the last class, is the only way that it can function as a singularity is an interval from the standpoint of this conical spiral rotation. And you'll recall we did the inversion of the fifth. We did the fifth up and the fourth down. And we actually generated a key change, which is the key change that begins the Ninth Symphony. Now I will point out that not all singularities in music are key changes, but the reason why I chose a key change is the reason that Lynn identifies, that you always take the highest standpoint to determine the lower standpoint. And Lynn has insisted in the article in the latest Fidelio that creative genius is the criterion for thinking, for anything that we call thinking. That is thinking. anything else is degenerate from that. If you want to understand the mind, then you look at creative genius, which is what psychology never did. Psychology always refused to do that. But common sense idiocy of the way most people would think is they would tend to think that whatever level they're thinking on, is that's what thinking is, that's what mind is, and then you have, beneath that, and you have creative genius as something that is incomprehensible above that. But you take the highest level. It's the same with language. It's poetry that generates language. Language does not come out of prose with poetry as some kind of refined super prose. Language is actually generated by poetry, and prose is a degenerate form of that. The paragraph is a degenerate form of the verse, of the poetic verse. And the punctuation of prose is a degenerate form of cadence, of the pauses that actually occur in poetry and in music. So it's from the highest standpoint that you determine it. That's why I looked at a singularity as a key change, because anybody could actually see a becoming. They could actually see a process of becoming there, and hear the individual interval as a singularity in that process of becoming. Not every singularity in music is necessarily a key change, but I wanted to identify it from that point so that people could actually hear the difference between a true singularity and these problems of seeing notes as isolated notes or seeing it as an interval in that kind of way. So that's just to remind you of what we looked at last time. We also discussed, as you recall, that the intervals are what determine the notes in the same way as the orbits determine the planets, right? That's the Newton versus Kepler debate, whereas Newton said the planets are self-evident, they're there, and whatever their mass is determines where they go. And Kepler said, no, the orbits are a pre-established harmony, and it is the orbits that will determine where the planets go. That doesn't mean planets are not important. I mean, try living on an orbit sometimes. Human beings need planets to live on. Likewise, notes are important. Notes are singularities. Lynn has referred to notes as in terms of the Aleph series. So we got to watch this, because sometimes we say, okay, intervals are important, and we talk about mere notes, then you'd have a tendency to downgrade the existence of a note. That's not the point. The point is actually the ordering principle of existence that brings the singularities into existence. So that is that. And so I went through notes and intervals, because from the Labor Committee, that's the way you would approach it. From the standpoint of musicians, the greatest problem that musicians have in terms of axiomatic assumptions is assuming the chord as the minimum, the basic building block out of which music is built. Because they get educated in this stuff. They get taught chords, and they get taught...
What do you mean chord? What, 3 notes?
A chord is three notes. Like, for instance, you have the major triad, C, E, and G, or the minor triad, C, E flat, and G. Minor chord, major chord, right? That's a major chord, and that's a minor chord. Every guitarist knows these things. Right? You pick and strum chords on the guitar, and this is the way that people are taught to actually compose music in the conservatories. And what happens with this approach is that you're thinking of a succession of vertical stacks of notes, and you're concerned literally is how to get from one stack to another. And the lines that are these, they actually do teach you that these correspond to bass, alto, soprano, and tenor voices, each note within a 4-voice chord. But what's happening is you're concerned with moving all 4 at a time, and you're generating a line as a byproduct of the chords, and which is ass backwards. You can't do it. And what you get is a kind of bizarre musical lines that sound kind of like a Frankenstein monster that took an arm from one place and a leg from another place. But it actually makes the process... Zarlino addressed this way back in the 1500s. He said, when music is concentrated on the horizontal, on writing horizontal lines, you have true harmony. And he said, whenever you concentrate on these vertical stacks of notes, there can actually be no true harmony. And we'll go into that a little bit tonight, how that works. And this is a very big problem in music, and it's a problem with Schenker. I'm beginning to think a little bit differently about Schenker. At one point, I was convinced he might be an agent, but I think Schenker may have been a guy who actually seriously was trying to rescue classical music, but could not free himself up from these axiomatic assumptions that largely came from Helmholtz, and they were predominant at that time. And I'll come back to it. You'll see where he actually is on the right track in some things. He actually comes up with an impotent formalism because he can't free himself from this. So, but before I get to that, I want to just go through a little bit. I did something last year. I started reading through some of the textbooks on fugues from Bach's time. They were actually written at the time that Bach was alive, because I wanted to test out a certain hypothesis. And some of them, I knew some of them were written by agents. Some of them were written by good people who were actually decent people. And what I found in going through it is that they generate the same problem as Gödel's paradox, as Gödel's proof with Bertrand Russell, which is that you can't be complete and consistent at the same time. It's actually pretty funny. The more that these guys, what they decide to do, is some of them, is that they're going to come up with a complete theory of fugue that could tell you how to write any fugue, or that could account for any fugue in existence. And there's one fellow named Marpert, who is not a very good guy, but he bases his entire study on Bach. He says, I'm basing this all on Bach's fugues. And he says, and I'm going to come up with categories of every different category of fugue possible. You know, ones that have the entrance after 2 bars, or ones after 1 bar, or 1 to 3 voices, every type of possibility. And I forget how many categories he comes up with, maybe 20 or so. And then what happens is that he has to admit later in his book that actually not one of Bach's fugues actually fits the categories. Now, this is a real problem, trying to come up with a complete accounting for every possible type of fugue from Bach, and then to find out that none of Bach's fugues actually could be fit into this. And it really does show what Lynn said, that you can't learn music from a textbook, that you have to learn music from musical discoveries. Because, see, Schenker had some understanding of this. Schenker wrote an analysis of one of Bach's fugues, and he says the problem that all these theorists have is that they're trying to find some kind of external outside formula to map onto this thing. And Schenker said the problem is that each fugue generates its own law. And he says there's a problem that's identified in the fugal subject, and it's the working out of the creative working out and problem solving of what is given in the fugal subject. He says that's the fugue, and so therefore each fugue generates its own problem and its own solution, so there can't be any kind of formal structure for it. But think of it this way. Think of this A to B that Lynn talks about. Now, you can see this on the higher level for an actual breakthrough piece like the Musical Offering or the Haydn's Opus 33 that actually makes a revolution in music. But in a certain way, this quality is already there in any successful solving of, say, a fugue. If somebody gives you an idea to make a fugue out of it, if you solve that problem and create a fugue, you've already got that. You've already got creativity involved. So how could there be a set of rules for actually to solve a creative problem solving? Right? It can't exist. And that's the problem that they run into. And so Schenker's absolutely right on that. And he goes through this particular fugue with his analysis. And yet Schenker ends up totally impotent, because Schenker says that there's no way on earth that you can educate anybody how to compose. He says this is a mystery. First of all, he says, I'm going to come up with the perfect explanation of music that can explain every note. And he says, I'm out to save music because it's being destroyed. And I believe he really did think that. I think he really thought music was being destroyed and he had to save it. And he had to come up with some kind of rigorous idea. But then when it comes to actually composing, he says, you can't teach anybody to compose. That's a gift from God. So he himself is impotent. But he also has no difference between Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven and Bach, because he has a formal structure. So a piece of composition either fits the formal structure or it doesn't. So there are great composers who fit the formal structure, and there are those who don't, but there's no way of actually identifying progress within that. And I brought along something here just to show you. How do you turn this on here?
Red button.
No. Yes, this is it. Okay. This is what Schenker calls his Ursatz, his basic piece. Now, see, he makes a mistake, and an axiomatic mistake, that comes from Helmholtz, where he says that the theme the theme of a movement or the theme of a subject comes from the unfolding of the chord of nature. He makes this assumption that that's your minimum, that that's your basic building block, and that it's unfolding that as a theme, that is what is the generative principle. But he also has a middle ground that's very interesting with a lot of stuff in it, that is background. This is his background. For this guy, there are only 3 possible backgrounds in music, and they all reduce to a chord. So that by the time he gets down to his background, all singularities have been eliminated into fitting into a chord. See what this is? It's the top line, that's the soprano line. It boils down to this. And the bass line is... So a piece that's maybe 20 minutes long boils down to that. That's version 1, that's 9. Or you have 10, which is like this. Or if you really get involved, you get number 11 there. And that's his proof. Now, I mean, this looks ridiculous when you look at it. When you look at his middle ground, he's got notes all over the place, and he's trying to account for every note. And he does show how the Motivführung works in the foreground, works in the middle ground. He has a lot of very valid observations, but he could not shake himself free of this axiomatic conception, which people just took for granted by this time. By this time, it was just taken for granted in music, and Helmholtz was dominating. And my guess is that Schenker probably never even considered to think about his starting point. He did all. It really is this case that Len says, where you build this tremendous edifice, huge edifices, on a false assumption. And this guy did tremendous work and tremendous amount of research and came up with a lot of valid observations. But ultimately, he built his castle on the sand, because it starts with a chord and it boils down to a chord. Can you just say a question?
What do you mean by foreground, middle ground, and background?
Well, in the foreground is the notes as they're actually played, and the middle ground is actually looking at processes over a slower length of time. Like maybe say something that what you do have in music, you have like a pedal point series, where you have things that are actually changing at a much slower rate than the notes are just going on in the page. For instance, if you know the famous Bach prelude. As it goes down, if you actually look at the bass line, it just goes down over 20 measures. It goes down the scale. That kind of thing. And so that is actually important stuff that you do have to look at in music. You can't just look at the notes that are flying around in front of you. Everybody who listens to music has a sense that there are notes moving quickly, but there's also a slower moving process in the background that is giving it order, that's proceeding more slowly in the mind. So, but this is what he calls his background, and at this point there's no singularities left, because he's made this axiomatic mistake. And I think it probably is the case. I mean, if he understood that each fugue generates its own problem and that you can't have a formula for it, that's an interesting insight. But my guess is he's probably never even challenged this axiomatic assumption in himself. And therefore ended up with a formalism which was really incapable of addressing composition and the generation of singularities in music. So you get this kind of craziness where he says he's out to save music and that he's got the explanation of how it really works, but he can't educate anybody how to compose because that's a mystery. Yeah? So he's infinite. So what happened with the theory at the time of Bach, you get all these people writing these books, and there's this huge gap between actual fugues and these theory books. And like I said, Marper kind of is the ultimate, but where he's going to base his whole system on Bach and come up with a category based on Bach, and yet there's not a single Bach fugue that can fit into it. This is a problem for these guys. So the way they started to solve the problem a little later on is they started attacking Bach. They said Bach was the problem because he wasn't obeying the rules. And there was a guy named Andre who actually wrote this, and he said, so the problem with Bach is he doesn't obey the rules. And even Bach's student, Pernberger, who was actually a very decent guy, trying to write, and he wrote some works on music, which I'm informed, they're in German, but I'm informed by Jonathan and others, they're useful. But Pernberger says, well, the idea of what are the rules is a dissonance. There's certain ways to generate a dissonance. you have to have a consonance, you generate the dissonance in a lawful way, and then you resolve it into a consonant, right? You don't just bring dissonances out of nowhere, but there are certain ways to generate dissonance and resolve them. But you're only supposed to have one dissonance. Kernberger says Bach writes 3 or 4 dissonances in a row, and this breaks all the rules. And he says it's true that it sounds good because of the music, because of the speed at which it's going or the way the music's composed. But he says this is really not a very good way to teach the rules to young people. So even though he was a student of Bach, he said I'd really recommend a minor composer as a much better way to teach young people the rules of music than Bach. So here's Bach's own student, saying this. And by the 19th century, they find a solution to it finally, which is to kill art altogether. What you then get are textbooks on the fugue, where instead of quoting any real fugues by any real composers, the pedant academic who wrote the book writes a little 2-bar sample from a fugue that he made, which is completely boring. And it's not even a whole fugue, but it does fit the rules. So, and this is where you get the phenomenon known as paper fugues. You've got all kinds of people alive today who can read one of these rule books and can write what's called a paper fugue. It's formally right in every aspect, except it's boring as hell. Okay? So I brought that up because it really does show this question that Lynn was talking about how you can't learn music from a textbook. You have to learn music from actually studying the creative discoveries of other people. So obviously from this, obviously you'd be wasting your time if you studied the rules of music, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you, Rodney?
Would you play one of these boring fugues?
I don't have one of them. I really don't.
He doesn't want to put you to sleep.
I'll get one for you, and I'll try to find one. I got a couple. I got one of those books at home with one of the little excerpts from it.
We'll bring it out to the table.
I can bring a couple bars, but they are boring. But answer my question. Wouldn't you say that based on this, it's a waste of time to study the rules of music?
Well, if it's not going to explain any kind of breakthrough, if it's not going to explain music, of course it would be boring. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. What do you say, Bob?
That's a trick question.
You can't.
Ronnie was supposed to have been set up, but he didn't fall for it.
You got it.
Bob's been in the organization a long time. He knows a little.
Well, I finally threw it to you. I figured you wouldn't quite bite.
Yeah, that's right. You got to have absolute rigor to be able to come up with, to go beyond, solve problems creatively. You can't do it just haphazardly.
Yeah, because then you got the OBE notion of creativity, don't you? To hell with rules and regulations. We're just going to be creative and do what we feel like. You give a monkey a paintbrush, the monkey will go paint. And we've seen the results of that kind of stuff. Then if you don't obey the rules, I've also seen people just try to compose without knowing anything about the rules, and they get some pretty god-awful sounding stuff. So it's an interesting question. What Lynn said in the article in Fidelio on Mozart's 1782 breakthrough is that what you've got to do is you actually have to master these rules, and then you have to push them to a breaking point where you actually generate a paradox or a dissonance. And he's not referring to dissonance in the ordinary sense of dissonance, but he's actually referring to a point where it actually breaks down. In other words, the Parmenides principle, which is fascinating because he once had a letter in response to René, a question to René about musical offering. And he said, well, what Frederick the Great posed for Bach was a theme that broke the rules of every single known rule book at that time. But the challenge to Bach was to prove that the thing that was breaking the rule was the actual singularity, which was going to generate a whole level of higher composition than had ever existed before. So, and we'll get at that when we get to the musical offering. I got to do some more work in it, but I've done some. I've already found that. Well, I'll tell you something interesting. This interval here. That breaks the rules. That diminished seventh interval breaks all the rules. As a matter of fact, that interval can also be a consonant. It can be B to G sharp. It could be A flat to B, which is a diminished seventh. But it could be G sharp to B, which is a consonant. Depends which key you're in. It's one of these intervals that has this unique quality. It can either be a dissonance or a consonant. But in Fuchs, this Fuchs, the Gradus ad Parnassum, the rule book was the rule book of the 18th century. He says you can't go within one voice by a major sixth. He says you can't go from G sharp to B. He says because there's too big a leap and it's got to be singable, which I find very interesting because you can definitely sing in major sixth. But all dissonant progressions like that are outruled in these rule books. So that's definitely one thing in the musical offering that is opposed exactly that, is a true singularity, which is something that violates the rule books. And is going to be the basis. The challenge of Frederick to Bach to write a six-part fugue is to actually prove that the thing that breaks the rule is the higher order singularity that's been generated. And this is something that Lynn has insisted on for as long as he's been reading about music, because the stuff he wrote on canons back from the 70s, what he said was, he said, by following the rules and writing a canon, you generate something outside of the rules of dissonance. So he's always had this idea that you actually, by pushing the rules to a limit, that's the way you generate a true singularity. But you can't do it by just simply abandoning the rules and doing whatever you figure. That's the OBE notion of creativity, which when you talk about creativity to most people, that's what they're going to be thinking of. They're not thinking of creativity in terms of rigor or work. It takes a tremendous amount of work. So just that as a caution, because I don't want anybody to just think, well, good, we don't need to know any rules, we can just compose what we want. So, and the other thing that I mentioned is something that Larry was talking about and that we were talking about with Pierre, I was talking about with Pierre the other day. And we'll get to this in subsequent classes, but Lynn is insisting on this Motivführung in terms of two ideas. One is pushing a process to the limit, to the breaking point. But the other is actually generating something outside of that process as a bounding principle. And in the Motivführung, he referred to it as very much like the question of the polygons in the circle, which is that, the Motivführung and examining the Motivführung within a piece is the equivalent of the level of the polygons. And what you actually have to determine is what is the bounding principle outside of that that's the actual creative principle. And he said you can't do that without pushing it to the limits. You can't begin to access what it is without going through the process of the Motivführung and examining the Motivführung. Just as you couldn't, get the Kuh's quadrature of the circle without actually going through the process of the polygons. But it makes sense. Larry was asking the other day, how could it be not in the piece? But if you read Lynn's latest paper, I mean, he makes the point that the generative principle of any set can't be included as a member of the set. And therefore, the creative idea of the composer actually has to be something greater than the composition itself. There has to be something greater than the composition itself. And it's not something, just as the polygons don't determine the circle, right? The circle determines, the circle is not the limit in the terms of an asymptotic limit gradually approached. It's a different species, right? So the polygons don't actually generate the circle as their limit. But it's by pushing the polygons that you actually make the creative leap to understand the higher species. And it's the same with the Motivführung. And I have some ideas on that, and we'll discuss it in future classes, because there's a few pieces where I have an idea on how this actually works. And you really do have to get into the details of the piece to actually begin to get that. But it's always the case that the creative idea itself has to be something greater and outside of it. And again, this is something that Lynn's referred to a long time back, because he's always said that the idea for a composition for a composer might be an elementary canon, that the elementary contrapuntal ideas might be in a canon. And we know that from two pieces of Beethoven. We know the second movement of the 8th Symphony, the top, 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 and we know the little canon that we've all sang so many times. There's no canon in the 8th Symphony. There's nowhere that it goes into a canon like that. And it's the same with the last movement of Opus 135, the string quartet. It's Musa. It's Musa, it's Musa. And again, you don't actually get that little canon.
Where do you hear that again? What piece?
The last movement of the string quartet, Opus 135. You've heard the canon is Musa.
Yeah.
And that string quartet it does something different. It turns it upside down. It starts out, Musa sign, and he writes that. It's in the minor, Musa sign. And then he flips it over. It's Musa, it's Musa, the way it is in the canon. So with the existence of those canons is very precious for us to actually have some of the ideas of the footsteps of the creative process, of how a very fundamental elemental contrapuntal idea was born. So you can learn a lot from the Motivführung. There is causality within the piece, but there's also something graded that's outside of that, which is what we have to determine in that sense. So, on that basis, yeah, okay, that's fine. On that basis, where am I? Yeah, okay, now I want to get to the workshop, because I think this is very important. What we're going to look at today is a Brahms setting of a folk song. And we're actually going to just work through it in certain ways so people can see for themselves what are the problems that a composer would actually have to solve in doing this. And it's very beautiful because it shows you something that we were talking about before, which is the negentropic quality of these intervals, which is that you can take something that would seem silly and it would seem banal and would seem incapable of development. And yet if there's something lawful there, then through polyphony, the capability for development is almost unlimited. And that has to strike a certain chord in us. That has to make us think, that's the same principle as the human being. You can take, in organizing, you can take a fairly simple person who's not that sophisticated, but if they have certain qualities of honesty in their outlook, then that person can be developed. Whereas you could take a Schoenberg concerto and you couldn't do a damn thing with it, you know? So, we hear that. Mozart makes variations out of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and part of the great joy that we see is you see the perfectibility of man. You see the quality of reason. You begin, it breaks you away from fixed notions of a theme, and as you break away from fixed notions of a theme, you can't help but break away from fixed notions of the human being and the capabilities of the human being. That's part of what it awakens in you. So what I want to do is start out with this. In the beginning, I just have Karen sing this melody once, just on no. And you tell me whether you think this is something that can be done anything with it or it's too banal.
Get over here, break me, get me. It sounded pretty good to me.
All right. Well, if you didn't know what was coming,
And you didn't see the Brahms on the
I mean, you might think this is a nursery rhyme or something. You know? Well, can you imagine singing it 6 times in a row and it would still be interesting?
Not like that.
Yeah? Well, that's the way it is as a folk song. It's got 6 verses to it. Got 6 verses. So, all right. So the first thing that I want to do. Look, when Brahms says to Jenner, the biggest problem you get in music is this business where people start and they don't have the whole, and they kind of work from one note to the next, you know? And what every composer says is, get the whole in your head. And what Brahms says to Jenner, when Jenner's trying to set a poem, Brahms says to Jenner, he says, well, just when you think you've got the setting, put the paper down and go for a long walk in the woods. And he says, what you got to do is go over the poem in your mind again and again and again. Till you have it forwards, backwards, till you have every detail, until actually what happens is it becomes a one. It says, what will happen is a germ of an idea will be born in your mind, with no predicates attached to it, just a germ. But through going through all the details of it, you'll get this germ, but it's a germ of the thing as a unity, as an entirety. And he says, and then you work from that unity to give it form. And that way you'll actually be giving it a form as an entirety, rather than working with separate pieces. Because whenever you just work from the standpoint of the parts and not the whole, you get something that's just patched together, and you don't get the one in the many. And that's Brahms' actual instruction to the editor. And it's true. I know this from working on this stuff. Whenever you make the mistake of, say, you know, like trying to set a poem to music, and before you've really thought the thing through entirely, you're working from one line to the next. And you actually have to have the ability to have the whole thing in your mind as a holograph, where you could plug anything into any different part. So that's what we're going to do here. Rather than just beginning to look at it, first of all, everybody here is going to participate in actually ear training and learning the melody. Because see, what a composer has to do is he has to hear something and he has to figure out what it is that he's hearing. Now, Mozart could listen to a piano sonata and play it right back to you. And for Brahms probably wrote this in less time than we're going to spend doing on it tonight. But the principle is still there. The principle is still there. That what Brahms would have done, even with a folk song like this, is have really taken this principle of getting it in his mind as an entirety before he began to set the first note to it. And as we go through this, you'll see in your own mind how you begin to get it that way. Yeah.
When you say get this idea in your own mind, I mean, Lynn has talked about that before, but from the standpoint of Motivführung, are you getting the whole piece in your mind, or and from that you don't from that condense then the Motivführung? You have sort of a theme. There's some interplay between the whole piece and the Motivführung as a germ.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think how that would work. I mean, how is it when he says take the walk in the woods? What is he trying to concretize in his head? The totality or the generate principle of the whole piece?
Well, I think both. I think both. But the reason he gives that advice is he knows what the guy's trying to do is to begin to set it before he's ready to do it, at which he's still looking at various parts and maybe coming. I've done this myself. Here's a nice line. This would fit nice in this line. Yenner describes this perfectly. He says what happens is you get one line set nice, and you like that, but it doesn't fit the rest, and you become a slave to your own creation. You don't want to give it up. This is my most beautiful line here. But it doesn't happen to fit with the rest of what you're doing.
Right.
And I mean, Jonathan, when he wrote those variations, mentioned the same thing. You have to avoid fixation. It's really easy to get fixated. You have to have a fluidity all the time, and it's a fluidity from which you can totally. The way I think of it is that it's almost like a word processor. Is that every change you make changes the entirety. You both change something in the local, and it changes the entirety at the same time. And that's the way the Motivführung comes into existence somehow like that. I mean, Lynn said that a poem actually comes into your mind first as a metrical idea of sound with no words attached. That the way a poem is born in your mind is actually determined with tones and a metrical idea with no words attached. Now that's a very interesting conception. Cantor describes something similar as a germ of an idea with no predicates, and then you begin to attach it to known predicates and begin to flesh it actually out. So it is a way in which it does prove, say for instance you're setting a poem through, what you got to do is in your mind you got to recite the poem, you got to think about how it goes, you got to think about the vowels and the intervals implied, you got to think about the punctuation, you got to practice reading it again and again and again the way it would be read until you actually have an idea of the poem as a whole. And that's a thought object. It comes out in detail when you recite the poem, but it's also a thought object that exists as that kind of a germ in your mind. And that you have to have it at that state before you could consider setting it to music. So let's just try to actually familiarize ourselves with this a little bit more. First of all, I'll let you know that we're in the key of A major. So will somebody please tell me the notes of A major? The scale. I'm somebody who doesn't know it. Somebody who doesn't know it that well. What's the first one, Kevin? A. Well, the scale's A. The scale's A.
Okay, so A.
Okay. It's not Canadian scale. All right, Larry, what's the next one?
I don't know the scale of A major. What it's going to be? I don't know what the flats and sharps are in A major.
Okay, well, we're about to learn. We're going to have to go through the circle of fifths sometimes so people can learn how to generate, because there's a means you can generate these. It's really important to know.
I know it.
Well, take a guess.
I don't know if it's going to be A sharp or B.
It's B. All right, what's the next tone?
C sharp.
Hmm?
No, it's
What'd you say?
C sharp.
C sharp, okay. The next one?
D sharp.
D. Next?
F sharp. E.
E. You got to go up the alphabet.
That's right. E.
You may have sharps and flats, but you never skip a letter of the alphabet.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, for sure.
What's the next one?
F sharp.
F sharp. There you go. F sharp. And the next one?
G sharp.
Okay.
And then A.
Okay.
A.
This is an A major. It's written for low voice. So let's just sing that scale, so we have that in our head. So sing it on solfege. La, si, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, sol, la, mi, re, do, si, la. Okay, now, Karen, just sing the first 6. All right. Was there one note that was repeated all the time?
Freedom.
Yeah. What note was that?
No.
Okay. Well, let's think through our scale. You tell me when we hit that note.
Eight. It's gonna be eight.
Well, you did. I was 8, right?
Yeah.
Everybody hear that? Okay. Now I'll solve it. I'll ask someone who's real smart. What time signature are we in?
Oh, Jesus.
Well, if it's 3, it would be 1, 2,
Yeah, but
3.
it's dot dot.
If it was 4, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4. And if it's 6, 8, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sing it again, Karen.
Two something.
Sounds like 6, 8.
6, 8.
How many say 6, 8?
6.
Yeah. Okay, that's 6. See, this is all the stuff you have to learn to hear in your head.
It's 6.
Because if you're Brahms, you may have somebody just singing this to you and it's not written down anywhere.
Right.
So he's got to sing it to you and you got to figure it out.
Is there a big difference between 6, 8, and 3/4?
Yeah.
Yep.
Short answer.
Okay, so we determined that that note that repeats several times is A. Okay. Now, what was the first tone? Sing it again. Okay, what's that first tone?
No, 6, 8.
F. F. F.
Well, let's go up the scale. Tell me when we hit it. La, si, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Anybody figure out when we hit it?
Yeah, it's F sharp.
Eric did. What's that?
It's F sharp.
It's F sharp. Okay, sing. Here we go. That's F sharp to A. We missed. Sing the first 2 notes, Karen. Okay, now everybody sing that top note. Okay, now tell me when we hit that top note.
There it is. Right
Right there. So what was that?
there. Yeah.
La, si, do, re, mi.
E.
It's me, it's E. Me is E, and that's the 5th. That's the 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th. That's the 5th in A major, okay?
Oh yeah.
All right? That's the 5th. The 4th is D. Remember that from the Beethoven, from the 9th Symphony? Okay, now, what's the next note?
That's C sharp.
What's this note that repeats?
C sharp to A.
Does anybody have any different ideas? Let's try going up to scale. Is it C sharp?
Yeah.
And that's the 3rd. Okay. Now, why don't you sing from the beginning and continue? So the next note changes. No, 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 no.
B.
And what's that?
B.
The B.
It's what?
B.
D?
B.
B.
Boy. B.
How many say B? How many say D? Okay, let's try it. A, B, C, D. All right, if it's D, it says. Right? And then the next one?
That's G.
No, it's B.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry.
No, but you have to put the,
The C, you have to put the
Oh, yeah.
the C and then the B.
Right.
And then D.
Right, thank you. Okay. Now, let's see if somebody can pick out the whole next sequence.
Your measure.
Where's the measure?
Because the first note is beat 6.
Right. Oh, yeah, okay, the measure comes over here, right.
D,
No,
No, after that one.
D,
Four.
C,
Oh, yeah.
D, A.
there.
Right, okay.
D, C sharp,
See, this isn't as easy as you think.
Yeah.
Not as easy as you think. May seem boring, but it's necessary work. A lot of work in this. All right? Now the rest of the line. No, 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 no.
Was that right?
No.
Right.
No, that was wrong.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
no, 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 no. No, 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 no.
That's D.
It's what?
Was
yeah.
it the D?
D.
D?
Yeah, D, C.
And what's the next? Can you tell any characteristic to the following notes?
Then the C, B.
Then back down to the scale.
Yeah, it goes
Yeah,
back
that's
down
right.
to A. The,
Yeah.
the scale back down to A.
Da-dum-bum.
Oh,
And what's the last note? What?
That's better.
The octave of what?
No.
It's an octave, you're right.
G.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
No. It's,
E. C, yep, E. So it's interesting, it's bounded.
All right.
It's bounded by an octave. It's bounded by the fifth, isn't it? Right?
Right.
Which is why Brahms starts it like this. Which is all, those are all octaves of E. It's like a little stretto on the piece before it even begins. You know there's something funny there, and you're going to find out a little bit later. Okay, so then that repeats. Now the last part goes like this. No, 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 no. What's that repeated note? No. Go up the scale. One, C, do, re. Right? It's D. So you're already getting better at it. No, 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 no. And what's the next part?
And then the C sharp,
C sharp.
C sharp.
B,
and then B, and then A,
A, and then B again.
and then
And, yeah, and it repeats.
It goes back
No.
to D.
And then it's the same thing. No, no, no,
And then back
no,
to
no,
C, A,
no.
B.
And what's the last part? No, 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 no. Well, no, 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 no.
C sharp.
Beginning.
Yes, A to C sharp.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is the same as beginning.
Oh.
Right? So that's you already see some interesting things. We see an interval of a fifth. That's a fifth. These are thirds. But then this is a third up. Here we have the scale, and then we have the lower fifth. This is then suddenly it's changed to the fourth. With the fourth is the predominant interval, and then it ends the same as it begins. Now, can anybody detect any element of Motivführung in this? Well, let's take two notes. Bum bum. And what's the next two notes? Bum bum. Bum bum. I mean, there's definitely a pattern of two notes, isn't there?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And does it,
And then you had to scale down twice.
right. But you get a few ironies, because it could be always divided into two. Dum bum 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 bum, and it's
Right.
all the way through it.
Right.
But you also get some interesting things, because you could get four notes here. Bum ba da dum.
Mm-hmm.
You could have that as a unit, or you could skip that, or you could just have da da dum. You could have three there. And here you get to repeat it. Da 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 dum da 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 dum da 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 dum ba da da dum. So you begin to get it in out of a two-note thing. You begin to get three and four notes. But it definitely has aspects of Motivführung to it. It's actually totally organized on two tones, on lawful intervals. And you might ask, well, did whoever made up the folk song, were they conscious of Motivführung? The fact is, the mind actually works that way. If you try to write music, you will end up writing motivically, even though you're not trying to. I've done this before, where I've tried to write something where I was thinking of something completely else, and then I looked at it later and said, hey, I just took the same thing and transposed it, or turned it upside down or something. That's the way your mind will actually work. So the more you look at it, the more you find is actually in there. That's quite beautiful. Now, the next thing you have to do, of course, you have to look at the words. So why don't you read out loud what the first verse says?
Okay. Auf Deutsch.
Yeah.
Sagt mir, o schönste Schöpfung mein, der Augen edle Zier, darf ich bei euch nicht kehren ein, als ein getreuer Hirt. Ich steh schon lang vor eurer Tür, und eröffnet mir die Port, die Port, die Port.
Which means, in a rough translation, tell me, my pretty shepherdess, the fairest of the fair, may I not enter in your hut, my life with yours to share? I've stood so long outside your door, good shepherdess, delay no more, O come, O come, O come. And there's 6 verses going back beneath Barnacle Bill the sailor and the shepherdess, where he said, let me in, and she said, no, I can't let you in. And finally she says, well, what if I do let you in? And she says, oh my, you're very handsome, aren't you? And she ends up, saying, well, let's spend our life together. And, so you definitely have progress in this song. Well, hand that piece now.
That's what you call that.
Want to just pass them around? Now, the way you would study this in school, according to chords, is what you do is you have to string a chord under each note, right?
What do you mean string a chord on each note?
Yes.
You have to make an accompaniment, and you have to make a chord at least under each of the principal notes.
You mean you would just add 2 notes on each note?
3 notes. And one would be in the range of a bass voice, one in the range of an alto voice, and one in the range of a soprano voice.
But it doesn't always have to be a chord.
What?
It doesn't always have to be.
Well, that's the way they teach you, is that you write chords on
Oh,
this. I
you're
mean,
just
that's what
saying
students
what's
do, is
taught.
write chord exercises. And now, see, the way that the rules work, the rules are they're kind of like the rules of grammar. They mainly tell you mistakes to avoid. They really don't tell you what to do. They just tell you can't do certain things like have parallel octaves and parallel fifths, You can't have... Okay, very simple. You get 3 types of motion. You should just know this in basic. I can boil the rules down to you. You have 3 types of motion. One is contrary motion. That's where one voice is going one way and the other one's going the other way. Right? You have what's called oblique motion, where one voice is standing still and the other one is moving. Which is something like that. And then you have similar motion, where the voices are going in the same direction. Something like this. They're both going down, right? Then you have a very special kind of similar motion, parallel motion, where, like, say, if they're thirds, they're going in parallel to one another.
They stay third part.
Yeah, so parallel thirds are okay. Parallel octaves, parallel fifths, don't Sound too good. The reason for it is actually they destroy the independence of the line. It begins to sound
Yeah.
the same. But those are forbidden. Now, once again, you can always generate an exception. Brahms had a collection of parallel octaves, of famous parallel octaves from great composers. He had ones by Beethoven, by Bach, by Mozart, by all these people, showing how this supposed forbidden rule was actually generated as something necessary by the composer. But the way the rules do go is that with these four voices underneath, there's a way to get to each tone of the next voice to avoid these mistakes. And what this is, this generates a musical line as a byproduct. But it's like, it literally is like having an arm from one place and a leg from another and a head from another. And this is what you get with hymns and with Christmas carol settings. If you've ever noticed, when you sing a hymn, like in these hymn books or Christmas carol setting, the alto lines and the bass lines and the tenor lines, they're screwball. I mean, you get a line just because it does move around, but they're screwball. You got a sense that there's no coherent idea of going from the beginning and then to a line. And that's literally why, because you generate a line as a byproduct of thinking about how to succeed chords. And this is like the polygons. I mean, you can never, you can get pretty skilled with this and pretty tricky, but you can't write music from it. So what I'm going to do right now is, Karen's going to sing it, and I'm going to play for you what a first year, first month chord student might write. I only spent 2 minutes on it, so it's, somebody might do it better. But this might be typical of what you might do in your first month in a harmony class.
Fred, I still understand the assignment of the student in your class. Why are they writing chords? Because there's already music written for this. Is this supposed to just...
To make an accompaniment for it, and to fill it, and to enrich it. So this is a chord version of it, okay? Okay.
Start? All right. Sucht mir, o schönste Schöpferin mein, der Augen neblet sehr. Darf ich bei euch nicht kehren heim, als ein getreuer Herr.
Right? Now, let's just listen to what Brahms did, okay? Go ahead.
Sucht mir, o schönste Schöpferin mein, der Augen neblet sehr. Darf ich bei euch nicht kehren ein, als ein getreuer Herr. Ich
So obviously mine was better, right? There's a big difference, isn't there? I mean, all of a sudden one is beautiful and one is stupid. And now, the thing is, you can get real skilled with it. I mean, by the time you're in second year, you can make Wagnerian chords and make it sound really weird. And you can get more and more skilled at looking like actual music. Just kind of like the more polygons, the more surface of the polygon you get, the more it looks like a circle. But the point is, there's a species difference that you never reach and can never reach from this standpoint. So that's what I want to, it's important to know this, because it would be easy to say that Brahms is writing chords. It's a simple enough piece and a simple enough accompaniment that someone who really fooled themselves that that was the approach that he had just taken, was to write chords. But now there's another thing about Brahms and Jenner, which is with this method, they tell you to make an interesting bass line. But the bass line ends up stupid. And try to make other lines, work as lines, but they try to make an interesting bass line. Brahms to Jenner once put his hand over the middle and wiped out and hid his inner parts, and he said, I only look at this and this, the soprano and the bass. And then Jenner realized that he had a nothing bass line that did nothing, and he had all kinds of fancy stuff going on in the middle. And that if you haven't composed a decent bass line, so that was really the approach that you would start from, would be to compose a bass line. So, therefore, let's ask ourselves a simple question. Let's try to construct a bass line. And I'm going to violate my own rule a little bit, which is instead of doing it at once, is just, now that we know it a little better, to just approach it from the beginning. So, say, if you just took up to here, the first 6 notes, what would you do for a bass line? What would be the right way to do it? Well, this is standing still, isn't it? Bum, 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 bum.
Yeah, you want a progression.
What's that?
You would want a progression with bass line. So it would go down or go up or...
Yeah, right. Isn't that the case? If this is standing still, you would want something that would move. You would want this oblique motion.
Right.
You would want something that would move in a different direction. You wouldn't want something else that just stood still. Would you?
You want parallel.
You want that? Or you want oblique, right? Because this is standing still. So you want something that might be moving against that, that's changing. Something's not changing, you want something changing against it. So just listen to the first three notes of the bass line as Karen sings the melody. Here's the first three notes. And can you tell what those notes were? Well, what's the first note?
A.
Yeah, you're in A major. I mean, that's
Right.
pretty much where you want to start, isn't it? So,
The next one is G.
let's...
John David. Okay.
So yeah, we started with A.
And then G and then F.
And what was the next tone?
G.
What?
G.
G.
Speak up.
G.
G. G or G sharp?
G sharp, I'm sorry.
G sharp. And the next one was
F. F sharp.
F sharp, right. Now, what do you have? You already have a simple idea of a counterpoint here, because in the chord version I wrote, I was just writing consonances, because you don't think of dissonances in chords, you just think of the chord. So the bass note and this are always consonant. But do this again and ask yourself if it's all consonances. I can do it again.
Yeah. Yes, that's a pretty big distance.
Which one was dissonant?
G.
The last one,
G sharp.
Second. Just to try one.
Because it's G sharp
Just try two notes.
Against the
yeah,
A.
That's the G sharp and the A. That's a dissonance.
Yeah.
But see, it shows you something about how you have to use dissonance, right? You can't just pull a dissonance out of nowhere. This is what Schoenberg would do. There you go. He would have. He said, I'm going to emancipate the dissonance. We'll let the little Dionysian pit creatures run loose. But this, you move from a consonance, A and A, to a dissonance, to a consonant. Right? So that's the way, and that way it sounds as a singularity. It sounds beautiful. It doesn't sound ugly.
Right.
If you just have a dissonance of itself, but if you do it in this way, it actually sounds beautiful. And that's what the rules are. The rules I was telling you about dissonance are always like that. That a consonance must prepare a dissonance, and then it must be resolved back into a consonance. And there's different ways of doing that. There's what they call suspensions, where they would go like... and that kind of stuff. But the thing that I said about Bach was that Kernberger complains that Bach will write 4 dissonances in a row. Now, is Bach doing like Schoenberg, and is Bach just simply emancipating the dissonance? Or is he discovering new rules as he goes along? Just listen to a little bit of this from the piece we listened to last week. Okay. Do you hear anything particularly wrong with that? Didn't sound bad. Let me slow the last part down. Right? Bach actually went from this, he went from this. We actually had 3 dissonances in a row there. But it has to do in a canonic form. Your mind is following the canonic form of the shapes of the lines, and it's actually moving along at a certain speed. So it's actually something that's lawfully generated. So Bach is not violating the principle, he's actually extending it. It's still lawfully generated and prepared, but you can't, see all these rules look at these stupid things in isolation outside of music. The way the rules go is you take two notes, consonants, two notes, the dissonance, and then two notes, the resolution, and it's completely reductionist. And it's not generating, and it's not actually in the context of actual living, breathing music.
Fred, when you say dissonant, you're just using a standard conception of not being harmonic,
Yeah.
and consonant would just be harmonic.
Well, certain intervals are characterized as dissonance, yeah. Now, Helmholtz said, because it's the number of beats. I mean, Helmholtz was kind of crazy. He said a consonant's, you don't get beats in a dissonance. So that's his notion of dissonance. And that's obviously, that's not what it is. This is, what we just had in the Brahms here is the lowest level of dissonance. What we saw in the Bach is a higher. What Lynn means is something completely higher than that. He's talking actually, Lynn is referring to dissonance, I believe, in these kinds of boundary conditions outside of the piece itself that actually that are the creative principles that go into the piece. And it's and that's something that actually isn't actually stated in the piece, but you actually have to hypothesize outside of it. And we'll get into some of that when we look a little later. But the lower levels of dissonance will be coherent with the higher levels of dissonance. They'll be coherent in terms of generation. And it's interesting because as soon as you do that, it changes it. Now, so, okay, that line continues. But now I'm going to ask you a question. Did he just do the reductionist exercise we did here? Because that's the way I would have thought. Make something interesting. If one voice is standing still, make the other one move. Is that what he did, or is there an element of motivführung in here? Well, look at it. Say it to the piece again. Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, ba-dum. Right? Da-da-dum,
Yeah, that's where he starts with.
bum, bum, bum. So what he's actually doing is, in turning over his mind, he's actually generating a bass line that is coherently actually derived from the piece in itself. And that way the bass line is kind of a transfinite on the soprano line. It's not merely an accompaniment. So now, the next thing to listen to, this repeats. This repeats exactly for the soprano. So we'll play it through twice. And ask yourself whether Brahms does the same thing in the bass line twice.
Sagt mir, wo schönst der Schäferin mein, der Augen endet sehr. Darf ich bei euch nicht gern ein, als ein getreuer Hirt?
Did he?
So he added something.
Yeah, he had
He added something there.
yeah.
It goes up.
He's moving in a different direction.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Because that's another simple idea that you introduced from Motivführung, which is what's called inversion. Here we had these descending notes going down the scale. And the second time, he just put in ascending notes going up the scale. Just listen to it in the difference of the first three notes. Try the first one. Try it the first way. The way it at first with just the first 6 notes.
No, 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 no.
And now the second time.
Yeah.
No, 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 no.
Now ask yourself this. Ask yourself whether that actually changes what she's doing.
Do it again.
Yeah.
Just listen to those two again.
Sure.
Okay, I'm just the whole thing.
Oh, keep going.
Yeah, so do it from the beginning. A little faster.
Okay.
Do they sound the same?
No,
No.
dude, absolutely
Isn't that
not.
interesting? Isn't that interesting?
Almost sounds like a key change.
Well, you see, this is in the nature of polyphony, which is that it's not like you have four voices each doing their own thing, and somehow there's some kind of social contract between them. And they don't, it's kind of like the phone team, actually. It's like the old, you could think of the phone team as four people off doing their own thing with no, but when you actually take the interaction of what goes on between people as an actual existence, then you actually see that polyphony changes it. You can actually identify that that's the same line if you really listen closely. But it's actually changed and modified by the interactions that it goes on with in polyphony. And that's the nature of polyphony. See, it's actually a Platonic dialogue. I mean, Kushrov used to argue with me. He said the Platonic dialogue is not between the voices on the page. He said the Platonic dialogue is between the mind of the composer and the mind of the listener. But if you think of the way Linz discusses it as different levels of consciousness, then there are different levels of consciousness in a drama. There's a dialogue between the players in the play, but also with the playwright and the audience. And of course, the highest level of dialogue is actually between the composer and the audience. But you have a dialogue going on between the voices that actually alters the character of the voices. I'll show you how one of the simple things works, which is that depending on whether this note that she's singing is a consonant or a dissonance, listen to the first time. And you tell me, you stop me when you point out which note is the most dissonant in the whole context.
Yeah, the first line of, the first beginning of the second line.
Right.
Yeah, right.
The D sharp with the A.
Right. That's right. It's right here, wasn't it?
Right. No, that's C, yeah, that's C sharp.
That was the most. Play it again and see if everybody can hear that. Okay, now let's continue with the second one and see if it comes in the same place. Where was it there?
The second.
The second, third, in the third measure.
In the third measure.
Of
Play
that
it again.
line.
You stop me when you hear it. Let's start again, Karen.
Right there.
Hey, it's the first A you get.
You had it.
It's the first A.
Not the first A, the second A.
Isn't that about it right there?
Where are you?
Try it again.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the C.
It's where?
The
There's a
C.
toss up there.
Let's toss it. Well, I would pick it at the B.
Oh, okay.
Really?
That's what I would
Yeah,
pick.
the
Well, listen to it again and just watch the melody up there. Okay.
It doesn't sound dissonant.
Yeah, it doesn't to me either.
It doesn't.
Well, play it just the, play the E sharp and that,
Play the what?
play the last, the second line, the last, where you think the dissonance is. What's the dissonance there?
It's this. And now, look, the next note where the C is, what happens on the C? It's already become consonant again. So the place that was the maximum dissonance the first time is now beginning to swing. So you actually generate the tension in the line at a slightly different place. Now this has everything to do with the words. Brahms is actually, this is very beautiful. This is why you have to have the whole thing in your mind, because he's looking at what it's saying. And it, not just from always the first verse, but from all the verses. Right? Like, take the second verse. This is the maiden singing. Okay? So, I'm sorry, try it again. A little faster. She's saying a little bit flirty, she says, and who's that knocking on my door and wants to enter here? And the stress, that dissonance is on wants. And then she says, my hut, I cannot open, I can't open it. Mein Hütling öffnet nicht. And it's on the öffnet that you get the stress. Listen to it once again.
On the verb.
On the verb. Yeah, it's on the verb. It's on the verb both times. So, and there's something very funny about that suddenly relaxing after that when she says she can't open it. So now you get what's called the Schubert principle in this, what Lynn identifies as the Schubert. When you're doing something that repeats like this, you can't just be thinking about one verse. You got to be thinking about all 6 verses and where the verbs come in each different verse, and how the performer is actually going to have to change the shape of each verse to actually make them different. In other words, the worst thing to do with a strophic poem. The strophic poem is where you get the same verse every time and the same music set into it. The worst thing to do with it is just repeat it the same every time. And Brahms makes this point with Jenner once again, that in a Schubert poem, in which you have 3 verses that are identical, they actually have repeat signs on them, each one of them is going to be played a little bit differently because of what's actually going on in the poetry, the way the verbs are, where the commas might be, and that kind of thing. So that's it. So you actually have to have a quality with something that you're repeating that actually develops. Now, at the 4th verse, we're going to play through the first 3 verses. And then at the 4th verse, you can see, looking at the words, that something different begins to happen.
Starts in the middle.
Now, the 4th verse, this is where she begins to relent. Can you see where it switches there?
Yeah.
After the repeat sign to 4? All right. What was it? Okay, sorry. And see if you notice a slight difference in the piano now.
will ich ausfahren, dann erhören deine Lied. Denn heute stehe Tafel schon und nur in deine Lied. Und sie sehen heute steht, die Tugend so, die Zeit, ich schon seit dir, seit dir, seit dir.
Yeah, sure.
Mir war ich so unbedacht, o edle schöne Herd, dass ich nicht derart wagt ein Schritt ins Grunde ab von dir. Oops, sorry, I messed up.
Okay.
Do the fifth verse over.
Okay.
Wie war ich so unbedacht, o edle schöne Herd, dass ich nicht derart aufgemacht, du hast mein Herz gerührt. Deinem Schutz Hilfe mein, ich will und seid dein eigen sein, ich will, ich will, ich will.
Now the last verse.
Werte Schäfer, mag dein Wort nur also auf dein Lied. So wahr ich leb, ich mach dein Schritt, jetzt kommt mir ab von dir. Mein Herz ist dein, o Werte Hirt, bis es der Liebe Morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land, ein
That's really something, isn't it? Because you can see in the fourth verse, she decides to let him in, and she's being a little flirtatious. But by the end, she's saying, you know, I mean, she's saying, my heart is yours until the end of time. So how does Brahms change that? Well, just go back. Look at the part that starts. I'll head it down here.
Oh, here, you gotta use your other marker.
Might be real plain to you, but back here.
Need more light. Oh, you get it. Look at that, say, for instance, in the first verse, where he's saying, oh, shepherdess, open up the door, the door, the door. He says, I stood so long outside your door, oh, please let me in, okay?
On page 3.
Well, starting actually here, at the bottom of page 2. Where it says, Ich stehe schon lang vor eurer Tür. Okay?
Ich steh schon lang vor eurer Tür, o Schäferin, öffnet mir die Port, die Port, die Port.
Now, look over on page 4, to where she says, Mein Herz ist dein, o Bertolt, es der Liebe machen will. My heart is yours, oh, and I will make my life with you. Okay? Same tune for her, but listen to the difference in the piano.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Werte Hirt, bis es der Liebe Morgen wird. Mein Land, mein Land, mein Land.
It makes it much more serious, doesn't it?
Mhm.
And what's the difference? Listen to the first one again.
Just sing it on the
the second one. Now the last one.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land, ein Land.
Well, I'll tell you, the difference
It's
is
the rhythm,
in the
it's the
motivführung.
rhythm.
Look at the bass line in the second
Two
one,
against three
Just
change.
first.
where it says, Mein Herz ist dein. And what's the bass line? Now think of what she's singing. Right? She's singing C sharp B A.
And he's going da da da.
Yeah, right. And he's going A B C sharp, the exact inversion of it. Just to get that, just sing those three notes. Do si la, do si la.
Do si la.
Hear that?
Yeah.
And then it starts out with the transposed version of that.
Maybe I should sing it, you should just play the bass line.
Yeah. Sing it once by itself.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land, ein
And
Land.
now I'll just play the bass line.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land, ein Land.
And that's so you're actually hearing it, and that's and once again to show you that there's no such that the accompaniment. You might think this stuff in the right hand side is chords, right? But if you take the top one as just a voice, just sing the melody from the beginning, and I'll just play that voice. There's a great irony there because he's actually making this thing stay still even longer than the other one did, and just kind of catch up to it at the end. Now go over to where it says Mein Herz ist dein, and look at the chords, so-called chords in the right hand, and what are they doing? Try to play it, and I'll just sing it, and I'll just play those.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land.
Now, if you listen to what's going, actually, look at where it says animato there under Mein Herz, and look at the lowest line in the soprano voice, and what do you have? It's the same as this. It's again that inversion of those three notes, and then look at the top line. At the end of the where it says Mein Herz ist dein O. Look where it says O. So you get this. So you're getting these things layered all over the place. It's really quite beautiful, the effect of it. Just and try singing it again, and I'll just play those parts.
Mein Herz ist dein, Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird.
See? So you got the same thing all over the place, and the whole effect of it is like this. So they're not chords, but you're actually getting a real density of singularities in terms of this Motivführung, which Brahms saves for the most important part, because that's what you want to do. And so that's why we slowed it down a little bit for the last verse. Just sing the last verse a little bit slower.
Starting with Mein Herz?
Yeah.
Mein Herz ist dein, o Wetterhirt, bis es der Liebe morgen wird. Ein Land, ein Land.
And this little bit at the end is I was just playing around with that fifth. It's just, it's actually, one voice is going fifth, it's the same, and the other one's going, and dum,
Yeah.
dum, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
you hear a little bit of an echo in that.
yeah.
So you actually have very dense polyphony going on here in such a way as it makes it possible to take a rather silly folk song and develop it for 6 verses. And maybe what we should just do is just do it once all the way through for people. And also, now you can get to appreciate the humor of the beginning too. Because as Pierre pointed out, it begins and ends with E. That's the boundary conditions of that line. And if you look at this piano introduction, you'll see you have an octave of B going down to E, another octave of B going down to E. That's all there is that one note. Which is that's the boundary conditions of that line.
Sagt mir, o schönste Schäferin mein, der Augen edlen Zier, darf ich bei euch nicht gern ein, als ein getreuer Herr. Ich steh schon lang vor eurer Tür, o Schäferin, eröffnet mir die Port, die Port, die Port. Verklopft vor meine Tür und will zu mir herein. Mein Bettlein nicht eröffnet nicht, ich lasse niemand ein. Und wenn auch die schönsten wär, so macht mir mein Herz nicht schwer. Umsonst, umsonst, umsonst. Finstere Nacht hat mich geführt, im Wald mein trautes Kind. Drum hebt mich stolz durchaus den Sinn und macht mir auf, wie steht. Ich hab mich allzeit aufgeführt, wie seinem treuen Herz geführt, allzeit, allzeit, allzeit. So will ich auf Erbarmen dann erhören deine Bitt. Die Pforte steht offen schon vom neuen meiner Welt. Ach Schatz, wie seh ich euch hier stehn, wie tugendsam, wie sanft, wie schön seid ihr, seid ihr, seid ihr.